I will get started then. So bonjour, Ani, bonjour, and welcome. I'm so pleased that you are all joining us this evening for the Dean's Distinguished Lecture, which is presented by the UBC Faculty of Education. And tonight we include the Association of Canadian Deans of Education. For today's event, we are using Zoom live captioning to ensure the event is more accessible and inclusive. It may automatically be showing on your screen, so please look to the bottom of your Zoom window for the live transcription button, where you have the option to turn it on and off, so according to your preference. If you need assistance, or if anyone is experiencing any audio or video issues, please reach out via the chat feature in Zoom. So Janice Herdishniakas, Anishinaabekwe, Chiging and Dojaba. A brief intro in my Anishinaabemowin language. My name is Jan Hare, and I'm pleased to serve as the Dean Pro Tem of the UBC Faculty of Education. Being Anishinaabe from the Chiging First Nation in Northern Ontario, I want to recognize that UBC Vancouver is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people, and UBC Okanagan is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. These lands have always been a place of living and learning for Indigenous peoples who for millennia have passed on their cultures, history, and traditions from one generation to the next on these lands. Their languages, knowledges, and livelihoods and rights are deeply rooted in these lands. And so while this acknowledgement reminds us of Indigenous peoples' long-standing presence on these lands, it draws attention to the complexity of histories and identities in which we as Indigenous and settler peoples are entangled. And in the context of this lecture this evening, I'm reminded that climate change is a manifestation of exploitation and degradation of Indigenous lands that we have come to occupy, and the people and knowledges that have long been marginalized. We cannot deny that climate change is a result of structures and practices of colonialism. So as a Faculty of Education, this acknowledgement means we must commit to processes of decolonization, reconciliation, as well as upholding Indigenous rights and title as original caretakers of the original caretakers of these lands. And as a Faculty of Education, we need to bolster the role of Indigenous people, as well as reset our relationships with Indigenous peoples as well. I would also like to recognize that you are joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners are caretakers of those lands. And so to learn more about the land on which you reside, I recommend visiting nativeland.ca, and I believe that will be posted in the chat. As we reflect on the impacts resulting from occupying Indigenous lands, as I've mentioned, I'm sure that many of our minds right now are on another invasion taking place in another part of the world, and the bombardment of the Ukraine by Russia. You may have seen UBC President Santa Ona's statement from a few weeks ago, and I want to take this moment to think about those near and far who are experiencing extreme hardships by this senseless war, as well as other conflicts of violence, other conflicts and violence around the globe. I would also like to bring to your attention UBC's Respectful Environment Statement. And this is here on our screen. We ask that everyone participating in today's virtual event recognize that we are coming here from different backgrounds and lived experiences. So please help contribute to creating a respectful and inclusive environment for our speakers, our volunteers, and our UBC alumni and community members. So I'd like to begin by giving you a bit of an orientation to the structure of our event this evening. So very shortly, we will be joined by our distinguished speakers who will introduce us to their work. Following their remarks, I will engage with our distinguished speakers to help us better understand how education can support the global movement towards climate justice and a sustainable future. Following our conversations, I would like to take some time to highlight the work of several researchers in our Faculty of Education who are presently working at the intersections of education and climate emergency, and those who are working with and for those who are disproportionately impacted by climate change. In the final segment of our program, We will be joined by two of my fellow deans who are representing the Association of Canadian Deans of Education, also known as ACDE. We are partnering with ACDE tonight in launching its new accord on education for sustainable future. So please stay with us for that important event. Over the past 2 years, our global community has experienced enormous stress, and we've witnessed and experienced the disastrous impacts of a global pandemic. Now in Europe, war threatens to overturn long-standing alliances and destabilize global networks. These are serious challenges indeed, yet there is a bigger crisis looming over humanity. Late last month, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report, and I believe it was their 6th assessment report, that presents a stark enumeration of the threats posed by our collective failure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Those threats include direct effects on health due to extreme heat, malnutrition, infectious disease, and displacement. They also include damage to cities and infrastructure, and longer-term extreme stress to ecosystems on lands and in the oceans. Most critically, the UN report outlines progressively deteriorating living conditions for millions of people, and those who are marginalized are disproportionately affected, including women, Indigenous people, as well as our trans and queer communities. All become more vulnerable to environmental catastrophes. The call to action is an urgent one. What must we do as a global community in order to secure safe, equitable, livable, and sustainable futures for all inhabitants and ecosystems on our planet, those humans and other than humans? Our society, our university, and our Faculty of Education are complicit in the trajectory towards the crisis. What are our responsibilities as scholars and as educators in the movement towards a better, equitable, and healthier future? And this evening, I'm joined by two distinguished guests whose lives and careers have been devoted to these very questions. I'll first introduce Naomi Klein, who is an award-winning journalist, columnist, and author of 8 internationally best-selling books, including No Logo, The Shock Doctrine, This Changes Everything, No is Not Enough, and On Fire, which have been translated into over 35 languages. Her most recent book is How to Change Everything, The Young Human's Guide to Protecting the Planet and Each Other. And I have to say, as an educator, I appreciate that this new book is written specifically for young readers. So I hope our educators have an opportunity to access this book. Naomi is a senior correspondent for The Intercept and an inaugural Mariel Franco Fellow of the Social Justice Initiative Portal Project at the University of Chicago. In 2018, she was named the inaugural Gloria Steinman Endowed Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies at Rutgers University, and is now Honorary Professor of Media and Climate Change at Rutgers. In September 2021, Naomi joined the University of British Columbia in the Department of Geography as UBC Professor of Climate Justice and is the founding co-director of the UBC Center for Climate Justice. Avi Lewis is a documentary filmmaker, journalist, and educator. During his 25-year journalism career, he has directed and produced award-winning theatrically released documentaries, including The Take in 2004 and This Changes Everything in 2015. He has also hosted and reported for TV networks worldwide, including Canada's City TV, the CBC, UK's Channel 4, and Al Jazeera English. In 2017, he co-founded and was strategic director of The Leap, a grassroots climate organization launched to upend our collective response to the crises of climate, inequality, and racism. And from 2018 to 2021, he was a lecturer in journalism and media studies at Rutgers University as well. In 2021's federal election, Avi was the NDP candidate in the West Vancouver Sunshine Coast Sea to Sky riding. And he is currently an associate professor in the Department of Geography here at the University of British Columbia. So Naomi and Avi, I'm really delighted to welcome you here this evening. And I know the introductions that I just gave really only skim the surface of your accomplishments and interests. So before we talk about education and the climate crisis, I would like to ask each of you to bring to our audience members an update on your current work and perspectives. So Naomi, I'm going to invite you to begin, if you will.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Hare, and everybody at the Faculty of Education who did so much work to put together this event. It's a joy to be with you. I am speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Shuswap Nation on the so-called Sunshine Coast in a community called Huelquai. And I am just thrilled to be joining the many wonderful scholars at UBC. I've just finished or coming to the end of my first academic year here at UBC. There's so much brilliant climate research going on here across every discipline. And on a personal level, it's really been a deep relief to be part of an institution that has affirmed at the highest level that we are indeed in a climate emergency. And further, that researchers and educators at every level have critical roles to play in helping shift our society and communities to safer ground. But it's also a heavy responsibility, because once we have taken these bold public positions, such as the Climate Emergency Declaration that was adopted in 2019, we must hold ourselves accountable to those words. So Dr. Hare, you asked me about my current work. I've been researching and writing a book about the relationship between the poisoning of our information and media ecologies, the spread of misinformation and conspiracies and so on, and the poisoning of our natural world. It looks at how climate change denial has given way to everything denial, COVID, election, you name it, they'll deny it. It also looks at how the attention economy and the pressure to see oneself as a brand or a product is becoming a major obstacle to building the kinds of collective spirit and purpose demanded of the climate crisis. But that book won't be out for another year, so I'll hold off talking more about that. But it certainly, I think, speaks to the challenges that educators face and the connections between climate education and media education, which are increasingly intertwined. Here at UBC, I have been doing a couple of things. One is teaching a graduate seminar on ecological affect, AKA climate feelings. The course is in recognition of the emotional impacts of researching collapse and extinction, and indeed of being alive and doing any kind of work in this moment. Part of my motivation in offering the course was to try to expand the frame of climate emotions beyond ecological grief and climate anxiety, and create space for students to explore a range of emotions that include anxiety and grief, but also include wonder, awe, joy, bewilderment, rage, numbness, melancholy, rootedness, and as we discussed this week, love, because of course we don't grieve what we don't love. Love and grief are the flip sides of one another. So later on, I'm happy to share some of what has come up in this course and some of what I've learned, which is a huge amount in speaking with the wonderful graduate students over these past weeks. My big takeaway is that ecological emotional literacy is a skill most of us need to learn. And the more skilled we become, the more equipped we will be to live in these times. So that's been part of my work here at UBC in the Department of Geography. And the other part, as Dr. Hare mentioned, has been founding the new Center for Climate Justice, which I'm co-directing with Candace Callison, who's currently on leave. And we are supported by an interdisciplinary team of scholars who are all involved in different climate justice research and practice. Avi is on the executive committee. One of our collaborators is your own wonderful Dr. Vanessa Andreotti, who's collaborated with us on a successful climate justice partnership cluster grant initiative. So the center grew out of UBC's Climate Emergency Declaration and the multiple ways that the declaration emphasizes the need for the university's climate work to actively seek to redress various forms of social and economic injustice. For instance, the declaration states that we should be enacting climate solutions that reflect our commitment to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the human rights of Indigenous people. It also states that the work should be building just and inclusive climate solutions that work towards dismantling historic and existing barriers faced by marginalized communities. I'm just quoting UBC's declaration. But it's important, as I said, to hold ourselves accountable to these words. Important because a failure to attend to existing and widening social and economic inequalities makes the impact of the climate crisis much more deadly and more socially divisive. Climate disruption acts as what is sometimes described as a threat multiplier, which is an overly militaristic way of saying that whatever is already bad without extreme weather, from a chronic lack of affordable housing, to repressive policing in racialized communities, to surging xenophobia, to colonial economic policies, becomes catastrophic and too often unsurvivable when climate disruption is layered on top of all of that. So we saw this very intimately during the heat dome less than a year ago. It had hugely uneven impacts. About 600 people died in our province. That made this the deadliest weather event in Canadian history. But if we look at who died, and we don't know enough about it, but we do know that many were living in cramped, substandard rental housing without ventilation or shade. Many had mobility challenges, which meant that they couldn't go to cooling centers. And these vulnerabilities often have a great deal to do with ableism, with settler colonialism, with the discounting of the labor of migrants, and many other forces. We saw more intersections with pre-existing injustices and the climate crisis during last summer's fires, during this winter's flooding, when First Nations communities were impacted severely, but did not receive as robust responses as many settler communities. So in this context, the new Center for Climate Justice is really focused on partnered research, which means taking leadership from these frontline communities. The way we think of it is that we're putting down roots where we are before we grow branches, because of course, climate justice is global and there is no such thing as responding to the climate crisis that's in a way that centers justice, but from a nationalist perspective. So we know that we need to have an internationalist lens, but before we go everywhere, we really want to be rooted where we are in these frontline communities that have been facing these staccato disasters. So we've partnered, for instance, with Tenants Resource and Advocacy Council here in BC, representing tenants across the province, to look at the intersection of this province's housing emergency, eviction emergency, renoviction emergency, and the deadly impacts of the heat dome. So we've got a project related to that. And we have projects in partnership that we're getting off the ground with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and the West Moberly First Nations to partner with them on what a true just transition would mean in Indigenous communities. So climate justice is not just about saying the right things or some kind of notion of political correctness. It is also rooted in a realpolitik recognition that a warming planet is not the only crisis that a great many people are facing in their daily lives. Crumbling basic services are also an emergency. A lack of safe, affordable housing is also an emergency. Food insecurity and water insecurity is also an emergency. If policymakers or climate activists asked people on the front lines of these various other crises to choose what matters most to them, climate doesn't actually stand much of a chance. However, if we design and advance climate responses that multitask, that do a few things at once, like lower emissions and build responsive, much needed social infrastructure, starting with those who are most neglected and most abandoned right now, then the movements calling for climate action may well find, the movement calling itself for climate action may well find itself with many more champions and far more determined ones. An extra benefit is that as we undertake this work here at UBC, we will be sending a powerful message to our students that though they are indeed coming of age at a frankly terrifying moment of overlapping and accelerating crises, they are not here at UBC to get a terminal planetary diagnosis and then be sent on their merry way. We on faculty are in it with them, marshaling all of our skills, determination, and resources to fight for their right to a just and healthy future, which it seems to us is the very least that we can do. Thank you.
Oh, so miigwech. Thank you, Naomi. I really appreciated the context that you're setting for us as we come up to the questions, but also, what you've signaled to us about the relationship of climate, biodiversity, and human society, and how these are all interconnected. And if we can address one, we can as well address others. So I'm going to now turn it over to Avi to share both his work and perspectives. Avi.
Thank you, Dean here. And it's a pleasure to be here with you all. Thanks to all the organizers. I am upstairs from Naomi here at our home in Huelquai, otherwise known as Half Moon Bay on Seychelles land. When we think about the responsibilities of education in a moment of climate emergency, as Naomi said, they draw us out of a kind of introversion. And for me, I've spent my career as a storyteller, as a journalist, as a filmmaker, and we make sense of the world through our stories, and in many ways, our stories make us. And on so many levels, the climate emergency manifests in the narrative space, in the space of storytelling, as an emergency of story, that we're stuck in old stories and we feel a deep need for new ones. And we see that our old stories of domination and conquest, the colonial stories that are riven with white supremacy, and an idea of extracting value from nature as the highest possible value activity for humans. Those stories are in crisis. They're holding us back. And I see a deep hunger to recast the stories that shape our lives. And that's the kind of work that I do. I think public education, the broadest sense of education, is what I've been doing all my career. And I feel humbled by that as I finally arrive at a more formal teaching role in the last few years of my life. The first course that I'm teaching here at UBC is a course called Documentaries and Social Change. I'm just coming to the end of my first semester teaching it here at UBC. And it's, I've made a couple of documentary feature films, and it's a way for me to share the power of that particular form with students in a way that investigates its unique ability to make us feel. And in this way, although there's a strong emphasis on Indigenous directors and storytelling in the course and on climate films, it spans a range of films in the engaged filmmaking, social and political documentary space. And what my students and I do every week is collectively construct a story about how films work on us and how they create emotion in us in a very technical way. As a filmmaker, I've come to appreciate through long, hard experience the thousands upon thousands of decisions that filmmakers and the whole community of people who make a feature documentary make. That pile of decisions, all of which in a way are lies technically. When you edit an interview, you take a conversation that you had with somebody and you chop it up into bits, you're immediately changing the nature of what exactly happened. And you build this huge mountain of decisions and creative decisions, sound and music and editing and cinematography and the lies of editing, and I say that, cheekily, to try to tell a deeper truth. And that deeper truth inevitably involves the emotion of the audience and creating a sense of connection between an audience and a story, a reality that you're bringing the audience into that they wouldn't otherwise access. What I really focus on in the course in the second half is, as we understand how the mechanisms of filmmaking, again, in quite a technical sense, withholding information, structuring a story, thinking about the role of a filmmaker, interview backdrops, how all of these things create emotion in the audience. we turn our attention to the theory of change embedded in a documentary story, in a storytelling form like a feature documentary. How does the filmmaker seem to think that this incredible work that takes years of a person's life eventually comes out and audience members choose to spend 90 minutes or 2 hours in the world of a film? How does the filmmaker think that this will actually assist in the process of social change? And I structure the course and think about it that way because as a filmmaker, I don't think storytellers think enough strategically about how the stories that we tell can actually be at the service of those agents of change, of frontline communities, of movement, of social movements, and other forces in society that are attempting, that have an urgent need for change, that are attempting to transform all of our broken systems. So that's one piece of what I'm doing that I feel really passionately about, and I love to learn from my students, and I think that's one of the secret joys of teaching. Many of these films, I teach one of my own films each semester, and many of these films I've seen many times, and each time as we filter it through the dialectic of conversation and of collective deconstruction of the meaning and the techniques, my mind is blown, and I find new vistas within these works that I find a really important source of energy for my own work. Related to this is something that I've been paying more and more attention to in the last few years of my career, which is I think that education in a time of climate emergency includes a responsibility to provide a response to the anxiety, the grief that is increasingly prevalent in society. And Naomi, in her course on environmental affect, ecological affect, spoke about expanding the range of emotions. And this is something that I feel passionately about myself. And in the last few years, I've really started to focus on offering stories about the future. And have been playing with forms of, like the one I call documentary futurism, making short films and other interventions that take place in the future. So technically they're works of fiction, but try to tell a story by locating the action in the future and telling a past tense story about where we are now. I've tried to make the notion of transformative change in our society more tangible, more palpable, easier to imagine. So I made a film with a bunch of people, including Naomi, who was instrumental on the project, as well as New York artist Molly Crabapple, called Message from the Future with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in 2018. And I co-wrote it with AOC and produced it with this extraordinary art team. It was a 9-minute animated film that takes place 20 years in the future and has this electrifying political figure in the United States looking back on how 20 years earlier, at the beginning of her career, we fought for and won a Green New Deal in the United States. It was a little bit more parochial as a kind of American-centric piece than I would have liked, and I tried to remedy that in a sequel that we made called Message from the Future to the Years of Repair. But it was fast forwarding to the future and looking back in a way of offering a story about change and how change happens and what is possible if we embrace not just the emergency of the climate crisis, but the vast opportunity to make positive transformations in all of our systems, in our public health system, in our transportation system, in our addressing the housing emergency, and in foregrounding Indigenous leadership, worldviews, and stories in the way that we reshape the use of the land and who has a say in how land is used, which is, of course, the founding issue of a colonial nation state like Canada. The most recent one, and I ran into Dean Hare in front of the Vancouver Public Library a couple of weeks ago when I helped organize and produce a press conference from the future, responding to a call from a number of climate justice groups to have a creative event that describes a future of just transition in a moment when this is before our political class and has promised legislation from a new agreement between the NDP and the federal Liberals. It felt urgent to tell a story of what a just transition would really look like in Canada. And I did it by co-creating with a number of important Indigenous leaders. Reuben George from the Tsleil-Waututh was the first speaker. Doreen Manuel of Capilano University, a great Secwepemc filmmaker, and Kupki Judy Wilson from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs all spoke, as well as a number of young climate activists and some family members, one of whom is a city councillor and one of whom runs the climate emergency unit. We fast forwarded to 2025 and spoke as agents of a new government, of a climate emergency coalition government that had done all kinds of things. You can see a couple of little logos in my background. We gave an update on the Land Back Act and how quickly land was being returned to Indigenous jurisdiction, and the establishment of the TMX Reparations and Healing Secretariat, where we took the more than $20 billion that the government has committed to that pipeline and instead invested it in Indigenous communities, in job creation, and in preserving and healing rather than ravaging nature in this province. And it's something remarkable that happens when you start telling stories of a different kind of future that are forged collectively, centering Indigenous leadership and the leadership and visions of traditionally marginalized and vulnerable communities, and the extraordinary young people who are leading the climate justice movements in all respects. And I feel like that is really so needed and so meaningful right now, as so many of us have a deep hunger for connection and meaning in a time that is a little surreal when it comes to the crises that we face.
Oh, so miigwech, Abby. And I have to say, yes, it was very nice to meet you 3 years into the future in 2025. And I noticed in your performing of the minister or creating of the Ministry of Just Transition, and you as minister, that you had created a task force, I believe, a housing task force, a land back secretariat, a Department of Universal Housing, and I believe you had a commissioner as well. So I'll be interested to hear what role education then might play in such a futuristic vision that you had presented in that storytelling. And so I'm very intrigued by your storytelling approach, because I really believe that stories do have the power to heal us, transform and change the world around us and our relationships as well. And I think, look to the promise, I guess, of stories as you're talking about creating a new narrative, perhaps new stories, maybe as a strategy or as a strategy for climate resilience. So yeah, so I will turn to some of the questions that I have set out for you here. And before we start, I do want to say just how pleased I am that you're both serving as faculty members at UBC, and that many of us in education are certainly prepared to engage in meaningful ways with the work of UBC Center for Climate Justice. So we look forward to participating as the agenda for the center continues to unfold. So just for our audience for the next while, I'm going to speak with both of our guests here in more detail about the work of education and the work that education can do to advance awareness and action about the climate crisis. And as a faculty of education, many of our alumni are educators or serve in educational roles in different ways. And so likely many joining us tonight will be from early childhood settings, K-12, community-based education, as well as post-secondary. So I'll start with a question here. And I know Avi started to address this, talking about the role of formalized education, but I'd like to hear from both of you, especially as you just spoke to these two courses you've been developing, but what role does public education or formalized education play in addressing the climate emergency?
You go first, Naomi.
Well, it's such a complicated question, as you know, because it really depends on which age group we're talking about. And I think that I think students are demanding it from their educators at younger and younger ages. Myself, I've always been a bit of an advocate of like waiting as long as you can before introducing existential terror. I mean, to be frank, I think kids can understand. We can be teaching about pollution in our local environments, and we can be thinking about our waterways. We can be thinking about our salmon. It's never too young to have a field trip to the local hatchery, and to have, you know, I was there at our local hatchery on the Sunshine Coast. They had a great program where little baby salmon were being returned to the stream. And then these little kids had buckets, and it was just so beautiful for them to be part of healing their ecosystem. But you know, as a parent, you know, I don't teach young kids, but because I did this YA book, I have interacted with more, you know, middle schoolers. The book is for like ages 10 to 15, but that 10 is important to me, because I feel like the longer we can make childhood really just about connecting to the natural world, we protect what we love. But that said, there's only so much we can protect our kids when there's wildfires and floods, and they're living through it, right? You know, I didn't decide one day, okay, I'm going to tell my 5-year-old about climate change. We were in the middle of the 2017 fires, and I kind of couldn't protect him any longer, right? Because he was overhearing all these adults talking about why the fires were happening, you know, with such ferocity. But I think those early years are just so important but throughout we need to be threading the love through, and we can't ever lose that piece of it. But yeah, I think that young people, you know, who've been leading climate strikes and so on, want their educators to tell them the truth. But that said, you know, when we released that short film in 2018, Message from the Future with AOC, we heard from educators, you know, at the high school, middle school level, who said, I played it in my classroom the day it came out. I played it the next day, because the students are so hungry for a vision of the future that is not apocalyptic, because that is all they're hearing, that's all they're seeing. And so, you know, it's just such a balance. And yeah, I think that the making space to process the emotions that are that come out when our fundamental safety is put into question. We can't gloss over it, right? If we're talking about our home being in crisis, our collective home being in crisis, we have to have the time to talk about the feelings that raises. Yeah, but when I talk to middle schoolers or high school students, I try to start with, what do you love about where you live? What is your attachment? And so everything that we talk about afterwards is coming from that place.
It's a really fine balance to be able to communicate climate truth without traumatizing people. And I think Naomi and I have both really leaned into love of nature and connection, and without offering utopias or shallow utopias, a genuine sense of credible hope in a variety of creative ways. But teachers need support to do this. And this is why, Dean Hare, when you are the Minister of Climate Education for the federal government, which I meant to appoint you that as I was just handing out ministries that day. You know, if the federal government were really serious about treating this as an emergency, I believe there would be a major communications effort that would reach into all aspects of society to convey climate information and to convey to equip people, including teachers, especially teachers, with the curriculum supports to be able to teach about the climate emergency at age appropriate levels, and also have a story to tell about what we're doing about it, which means it can't just be a story. We've got to be doing things about it. So it's a holistic effort that's required, but I don't want to minimize how tricky it is for teachers and how much support teachers at all levels need in order to convey this very sensitive, very urgent information so that it doesn't paralyze people or traumatize people, but so that we actually build the societal momentum that we need and the consensus that we need for deep change.
Yeah, there's no therapeutic solution to climate anxiety. It's a rational response to an irrational situation and to irrational policy. And I think the best thing we can do for our young people's anxiety, and Frank, I don't exclude myself. I mean, if I knew how to solve climate anxiety, look, I think it's important that we not pathologize it. The far more pathological response is to be in power and not take climate action.
I think what I've really appreciated here is that, you both talked about, you're never too young to start learning about climate change, climate emergency, and that this is a really difficult, it can be a very difficult concept, I guess, in that it can produce this kind of anxiety. But I agree. I think you're not too young to start. I think even early childhood, Naomi, some of the things that you were talking about, this love of nature, where it is that we, what do we love about where we live, and how young children are so really invested in those kinds of understandings. So I appreciate that. And then I think you're right. It's, thinking about what are the appropriate kind of pedagogies, that we can introduce then at these different ages and stages of development that can help manage those kinds of, or help, I guess, not just manage those emotions, but help them grapple and deal with the kinds of emotions that come with this learning. So I agree, the need for curriculum and appropriate pedagogies are certainly really important.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story, but I mean, I think I'm sure you know this, and so many people on this call do, but young people respond to role models. And so hearing stories of other young people who they can relate to, who have had an impact, because they're smart enough to know that, yeah, it's great if they bike to school, it's great if they recycle, but they understand that if you present them with a planetary scale crisis and then give them like a very small consumer response, that's not going to be enough. That's part of it, but part of it is also telling the story of the youth climate strikes, of the Sunrise Movement, getting the Green New Deal on the agenda, of how young people in Bella Bella played a central role in stopping the Northern Gateway pipeline, or hearing about Autumn Peltier, a Anishinaabe water protector. And so having those stories makes a huge difference in terms of their young people feeling like I can change the world.
Well, I'll head to my next question then. You did start to talk about climate anxiety. So how can educators mobilize youth climate action while not increasing that kind of anxiety? You've talked one strategy, which I think is great, like looking at role models and the work that they're doing, that how empowering that can be. Are there other kinds of strategies that you think about in your work?
I mean, this whole subject area was harder pre-Greta. And I think, Greta Thunberg is just one. And I think Naomi did a really good job of not centering youth climate action on an image of one person in one place. But I think we've talked a lot so far about the positive, about what educators can offer. I also think I want to draw a line under something that Naomi just said, because recycling I think for the educators who are in this elementary, from early childhood to before post-secondary, all of those levels, the overemphasis on recycling in the education system, in the curricula, in the culture, I think needs to be pulled back, to be honest. The truth about recycling, when you really dig into it, is that these days, a minority of products that we put into the recycling system are actually being recycled and repurposed. And there's a tremendous amount of single-use plastic that's going into a bin and out of our lives, and we think that we've done the right thing. And that's not supported by a lot of the current research and facts. but the centrality of recycling and the childhood experience of what can we do about the natural world it's kind of rote at this point. So I think there's some undoing to do if we're prepared to ask some of those difficult questions. There's lots of other things to emphasize, and we've touched on some of them, but we have to look at what some of the solutions that we're offering to young people and really think critically about their whether or not, because young folks are smart, they have access to a lot of information more than ever in history. And as Naomi said, when you offer a single household or a single individual consumer solution to a clearly systemic problem, young people are unsatisfied and start to and become more vulnerable. I think that talking about solutions is critical. And the beautiful thing about an intersectional climate lens and thinking about climate justice in its most expansive sense is that there are solutions in every sector of society. There are solutions in housing, there are solutions in transit, there are solutions in the food system, there are solutions in Indigenous rights and on learning about them and understanding the centrality of Indigenous leadership in the climate movement. And so there are many, when you start talking about climate solutions, the field is broad, and I don't think anyone is too young to start getting a sense of how many places we can make an impact.
You know, I think about, I was a primary school teacher, and you're right. It was reduce, reuse, recycle, and it was very reductive in terms of the curriculum. And I'm going to have to tell you, or I have to tell you, one Halloween, I went as a blue recycling bin, and I was all dressed in a blue box with like cans hanging out and things pinned to me. But you're right. It's our curriculum can be quite reductive. And I think what you've, suggested to us here is that we do need a curriculum change, and one, that draws on interdisciplinary perspectives, other worldviews in this work. So Naomi, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, I would just do a pitch for doing one of these, if it feels appropriate, engaging in an exercise of speculative fiction. Young people, in my experience, young people love it, and so we use this film, these short films, just as an inspiration. So when Greta came to the U.S., we had an event with her and 4 young climate leaders from diverse backgrounds, and we asked them all to write letters from the future to tell the story of how we won, and they rose to the occasion without missing a beat. And they've actually found it much easier to imagine a better future than people of my generation. Their imaginations are looser; they can just go there. It was very, very beautiful. And so, yeah, I think, and I've heard from educators who've done similar exercises in classes. For my graduate seminar, we're doing an essay. The final essay is write a eulogy. This is pretty heavy, but write a eulogy for a place, an ecology, a landscape, a species that you're attached to, and then write the story of how it was avoided. So it sort of accesses both like the emotions, the grief emotions, which are there and need to be felt, but also, it empowers them to tell a different kind of story. We'll see how that goes. But I think we need to try new things, I guess. But I would just make a pitch for emotional literacy, and in developing the syllabus for this course, I feel like I found some really great. I mean, the best way to inspire people is to get them to read good writing, and thankfully more artists, not just writing, but music. More artists are stepping into this space, and I'm excited that Jarrett Martineau has joined the Chan Center, and he's going to be doing programming. And some of Jarrett Martineau hosts Reclaimed on CBC, an Indigenous music show, and he's going to be bringing lots of Indigenous artists to the Chan Center. But he and I have been talking about bringing different artists musicians who are engaging with climate feelings, and I think we need all the tools to honestly break our hearts open, because this isn't just going to be in our heads. I think we've had it in our heads for a long time, and that hasn't been quite enough.
Yes, I just like what you say, break our hearts open, and I really appreciate the strategies that you're sharing here, and I think that would be very useful to educators in some of their own practices. So, I'm going to turn to another question. How do you think about, or how do we engage youth in this topic of climate change, climate action, um, in ways that, how do you engage youth in this topic of climate change and action in ways that we can avoid triggering or re-traumatizing? So you've talked here about this interdisciplinary approach, being inspired by music and role models, but how might educators nurture youth in these topics while they're still forming their own stories, that is, their own identities and their own connections to the world?
That's a big one, and it speaks to the responsibility that educators have. And I think, for me, I take this as a personal challenge, as a personal challenge. How am I engaging with these subjects? What energy am I bringing to it? And am I modeling an approach that is curious about facts and the real situation that we confront, but is not conveying a relentless message of doom? And so it is this balance which speaks to the energy and the spirit and the attitude that we bring to it. And I think, just listening and watching very carefully when you're dealing with these subjects of immensely high stakes is critical. Because putting your head down and doing the lesson plan in front of you, it's something we all need to do as educators from time to time. We have to get through our day too, but there's usually signs that someone is struggling, and I just think it's that vigilance that we have to be listening as much as we're talking when we when we try to take on these really heavy matters.
Well, I've been thinking about, I'm thinking about your filmmaking course, for example, and and the way you're helping students, construct and curate their stories. How is it then that do you use that, this kind of, you're saying let's avoid this relentless feelings of doom, but do you use that as a strategy ever, or?
I mean, we talk about it in this course. We talk about it at the beginning, and very intentionally, a kind of a blanket trigger warning for the subject matter. So we spend some time talking about, what are social and politically engaged documentary films about? They're about police violence. They're about trauma. They're about war. They're about the hardest and most upsetting human subjects. And how are we dealing with this form as a group of people in a room who are having a common experience? And I think naming that and recognizing that, and as a teacher, it's relatively easy to say, take a look at the material before we get to the class, and if there's something that's particularly upsetting to you, let's talk about a way that we can do other. There are always other options to deal with someone who can't manage a particular subject matter or piece of work. But more importantly, how do we construct meaning together in relationship to a work like a documentary film that acknowledges the power and the agency of the subjects in the films, that sees the communities represented, however the filmmaker chooses to represent them. What can we bring to the understanding of the work that emphasizes agency and doesn't just relentlessly document the ills? And I curate the films very carefully because I think that there is a lot of material out there that's just hard and relentlessly so. And so choosing works and choosing curriculum that offers other spaces for students to step into, I think is really important. So it starts in the conceiving of the materials.
Naomi.
Yeah, I know we're running out of time, so I just it strikes me that one of the things that was really quite traumatizing for a lot of young people who I know in the climate movement was just the timing, frankly, of the pandemic, because the youth climate movement was on a roll. They were growing so fast; it was staggering. I had never seen anything like the growth of the climate strike movement. To go from hundreds of thousands to 1.5 million to like millions of people in the streets. And young people were really feeling their power. and talking and sharing about how they'd felt so alone, and they would just felt like, the isolated kid with these strange interests at their school. And then they looked around and they saw there were millions of young people like them around the world who were also scared. It was so moving, and they were inspiring their elders to step up. And I mean, think about that moment in 2019, and then bang, it shut down. And they all went back to their bedrooms. And, I've visited some of those rooms, via Zoom, when How to Change Everything came out. And it was a little eerie, right? Of just the suddenness of going from that peak feeling of strength to that extreme isolation, right? So I think, first of all, I think we should acknowledge that that was rough. And then in thinking about, the wonderful support that so many students received from their teachers, supporting their walkouts and really cheering them on and having their back and saying, this is amazing. Look, it's traumatizing to be in this moment. We can't change just how extreme these years have been, with the layering of COVID and climate breakdown, and for Indigenous communities, the unmarked graves. I mean, young people are carrying so much. So I think it's really, really important that they not receive a message that there's something wrong with feeling rage or betrayal, or even a sense of hopelessness. But we need to help them find outlets, and most importantly, find their voice, find their power again. As they did in 2019. I think, frankly, it's the best therapy is action.
I mean, I wish we had more time, because I would be very interested to hear more about, given what you're talking about, and this notion of, we are really in this traumatizing moment. And I'm thinking about the things that your students are writing and these eulogies. And as an educator, I'm going to say, I'm very interested to know how those are assessed, how you assess that kind of
I give
emotional.
them always.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask one last question, because you're right, I am mindful of your time. I have so many. So I'll just ask this. Maybe can you speak to the role of educators in either the either in the Green New Deal or the LEAP manifesto? And maybe for our audience, you might, if you're going to choose one of those, maybe a little context for the audience.
I'll speak a little bit about the Green New Deal, which is a proposal for a wartime level public investment in climate action that sees all of these different sectors of society as involved in climate solutions. It is the transformative change vision, which has emerged in part from the United States, although its roots are in many previous climate justice movements in the Global South and in vulnerable and marginalized communities throughout the Americas and elsewhere. But the Green New Deal, very closely associated with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and this new insurgent politics in the United States, has also really strongly resonated in Canada and is part of our political discourse now. And I think that the role of education in a Green New Deal, which proposes, pandemic level public spending on climate solutions, and that's basically it. It's as simple as that. Public spending that will vastly and dramatically and quickly reduce emissions, while at the same time creating alternative economic development pathways for resource communities, for Indigenous communities, functioning transportation system, unplugging the housing emergency where an entire generation of young people have no hope of ever owning a home, and renters live under landlords that are corporations and numbered companies that boast to their shareholders about rent-evicting people so that they can jack up rents. All of these intersecting crises need to be dealt with at once. And the Green New Deal has really, really powerful new ideas for solutions in the education space. There's a magnificent piece of legislation, a kind of model legislation. It was never thought that it would pass, but it was to set a high watermark for what a Green New Deal would look like in education, introduced in the US Congress by one of these new insurgent politicians, Jamal Bowman, who of course was a middle school teacher in the Bronx, I think. a principal, sorry, in a school in New York City, and is now the congressional representative from that part of New York. And he introduced the Green New Deal for Schools bill that really addressed the infrastructure deficit in schools in Canada. I mean, it's even worse in the United States, but it's in the tens of billions of dollars at minimum to restore the physical learning environments. And now we know that we need incredible air filtration and we need outdoor spaces. And we have a whole new public health reality that speaks to the built environment and that needs major public reinvestment. And in this process of reinvesting in the physical infrastructure of education, we need more teachers and we need smaller classrooms, which would be safer and better learning environments.
We need to pay EAs really well.
And we need to pay everyone in the education system, including all of the staff and daycare workers. And we're starting to see national childcare roll out now. But all of this can be part of a major shift where we embed values of connectedness in a society-wide mission to reduce emissions and increase equality at the same time. And so our schools need a lot of work. And the physical work is a metaphor for the work that we need on curriculum, on class size, and on many, many other functions. And they should be done all at once. And so I think that the vision for education in the Green New Deal and in the climate justice movement is really central, because it's not just about storytelling and teaching in a different way. It's about the sites of education and the centrality of education in a society-wide response to the emergency.
Well, I'm sure you're maybe hearing the virtual claps of all the educators who are joining us tonight. So Naomi.
Well, I would just add, I said pay EAs because, there's really a crisis going on in the schools right now. These jobs are hard; they're getting harder, and people are leaving, and it's hard on workers and it's hard on students, and when we think about a Green New Deal for education, I hope that we remember that really also means equity, and including equity for kids who are neurodiverse. Greta describes her autism as a superpower. A lot of, I have found that there's many kids on the spectrum in the climate movement, in part because they're just weather vanes. They're so porous, and they trust their instincts a little bit more. They mirror a little less. They look to social media less to figure out what they should feel, and they trust what they feel. But we really need to support these kids. I mean, Avi and I are parents of a special needs child, but I don't think it gets talked about enough, that we need to be supporting all disabled kids. They have so much to bring to these movements. They are bringing so much to these movements, and we need to make sure that they feel really included at school, and that the people who support them are supported.
Well, Timigwat, I just want to say that just how appreciative of your presence here this evening that I am, and I'm sure all of us here. You've presented so much for us to think about as educators and researchers, as public intellectuals, and certainly as agents of change. So please accept my very sincere thank you, or Chimigwach is what I would say in my Anishinaabe language, for just your inspiring words, the kinds of strategies that you talked about, the complexities, of working with climate action, climate emergency in schools and for educators, and for, kind of giving them that space, recognizing the complexities, and then, how do we teach and this with younger children. So I just really appreciate that that space you provided. So I know you're not able to remain with us for the rest of the program. So I just want to ensure that we have fully acknowledged your contributions this evening. So Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
It was a great pleasure being with you.
And we look to hopefully some more opportunities to, I believe you called it research partnerships, and certainly
absolutely
some collaborations with the faculty. So
just wonderful. The beginning. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Rama Pete. So before we move forward in our program, I'd like to take a few moments to share with you some of the related work that we've been doing in the Faculty of Education. So I know we're going to have a series of slides, and Naomi Klein mentioned Dr. Vanessa Andreotti. And so first I'd like to highlight her work, who's together with Dr. Sharon Stein, as well as Dr. Kash Hennekew, all in the Department of Educational Studies, and members of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Arts Research Futures Collective. They're working in close collaboration with Indigenous communities, and one in particular, ACDE. And so Dr. Andreotti's projects highlight the vulnerability of the Amazon rainforests, the risks of false climate solutions, and the importance of placing Indigenous rights at the center of the climate agenda. And certainly we also heard that from both Naomi and Avi about Indigenous peoples' participation in solutions for the climate emergency. I also want to bring to attention Dr. Derek Gladwin's work, and I also want to acknowledge Dr. Gladwin as assisting in developing some of the questions that formed our conversations tonight. So thank you, Derek, for that. So Dr. Derek Gladwin's work is to promote social understanding and relational action on environmental health and well-being and cultural issues through public forms of education and literacy. And he's presently teaching an environmental literacy course that bridges natural and virtual ecologies across a range of disciplines, epistemologies, and ontologies. And the course develops ecological approaches to literacy education and research that emphasize sustainability within interconnected systems and the creative potential for ecological education rooted in lived experience. Dr. Gladwin is in the Department of Language and Literacy Education, and he is the author of several books, including Ecological Exile and Rewriting Our Stories. Also, I want to acknowledge Dr. Kendrick James' work, which is focused on digital innovation in language and literacy, with a focus on creating sustainable discourse ecologies through creative and community-oriented place-based learning. And what he does is he takes a multimodal and multisensory approach to creative software development, and with his research extending from the use of these projects into educational contexts. And lastly, I do want to draw attention to Dr. Sandra Scott's life work, which is characterized by themes of wonder through inquiry, advocacy and action, environmental education as place lived through eco-pedagogy, and ways of knowing, being, doing, and healing through the 4 R's of respect, reciprocity, relatedness, reverence, and I believe a 5th, responsibility, and also the language of animacy. And so these images, which we see here in the slide, represent relationships of love, joy, loss, grief, and action with key and kin of the Salish Sea. Well, this brings us to the final segment of our program this evening. And so it represents a commitment that goes beyond this evening. And so as Dean of Education, I'm part of a larger organization, as I mentioned at the outset of this, the Association of Canadian Deans of Education, which represents 60 faculties of education across Canada. And the ACDE, as it is known, has been working for more than 3 years on a new accord, the Accord on Education for a Sustainable Future. And I'm really proud that tonight's Dean's Distinguished Lecture can be the forum in which to launch this brand new accord. So I'm going to invite Dr. Sharon Wall and Dr. Richard Barwell to tell us more about the new accord. So Dr. Sharon Wall, she is the Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of New Brunswick, and she's president of the ACDE, and Dr. Richard Barwell, who is the Dean of Education at the University of Ottawa. So Sharon and Richard, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jan. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for staying online to help ACDE launch a very important publication. My name is Sharon Wall, and I am the Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of New Brunswick. I come to you from the unceded and unsurrendered traditional land of the Wolastoqiyik. I'm also privileged to be the president of the Association of Canadian Deans of Education, or ACDE, as Jan has let us know. It's, as we call it, a group that represents 60 faculties, colleges, schools, and departments of education across the country. Collectively, ACDE members are responsible for the initial education in both languages of virtually every public school teacher in Canada. Thousands of new teachers every year. ACDE is one of the major contributors to and advocates for public education in Canada. Part of ACDE's mandate is to create space for discussion and dialogue about topics of broad concern, with many of these discussions encapsulated in our accords. Our accords speak to high impact topics that pertain to our spheres of influence as deans, including Indigenous education, early learning and early childhood education, and educational research, among many other important topics. Our latest accord, which my colleague Richard will introduce you to, addresses one of the most critical challenges of all, as we've been talking about all evening: education for a sustainable future. UNESCO, in its Education for Sustainable Development documents, states that learning must prepare students and learners of all ages to find solutions for the challenges of today and for the future. We hope that our accord can assist with that work in Canada. Now, I'd like to turn the microphone over to my colleague, Dr. Richard Barwell, who will tell you more about the accord and what its development means for ACDE and for faculties of education from coast to coast to coast. Richard, over to you.
Oui, kakana, Richard Barwell, Nindigenekas, bonsoir, je m'appelle Richard Barwell. Good evening, my name is Richard Barwell, and I am Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Ottawa on the unceded lands of the Algonquin people. Thank you, Sharon, for explaining the context for this new accord. Everyone here this evening is under no illusions about the need for urgent action to reverse the damaging habits to which we and our societies have become addicted. Naomi's and Avi's work attest to that, as do the calls of our youth, led by, among others, Greta Thunberg, as we heard earlier. One place where urgent action is needed is in education and schools. And that means that faculties of education need to play their part. As we just heard, Canada's faculties of education prepare almost all of our public school teachers. How are we preparing them to be leaders to ensure a sustainable, livable future for our children? What is our role as educators, as faculty members, or as deans of education even? ACDE, representing 60 faculties of education across Canada, acknowledges that we are complicit in the environmental crisis affecting our planet and that we have a role to play. For the past 3 years, since the time of the climate strikes, I have worked alongside a group of deans and expert faculty members to develop a framework for faculties of education to guide this urgent work. I thank Ron MacDonald, former dean at the University of Prince Edward Island, for co-supporting this process with me. Miigwech, merci, thank you to everyone who contributed to the working group or who provided feedback on drafts or who encouraged us in our work, including by voting to ratify the document. So today, now, we are pleased to launch the ACDE Accord on Education for a Sustainable Future. We, ACDE members, believe that education is both a source and a reason for hope, inspiration, and change. It is that central belief that lies at the heart of this accord, hope. And can we see the next slide? I'm not seeing slides. Perfect, thank you. So the document, the accord, sets out key principles for faculties of education to adopt as they work out their own individual plans. These principles, you can see them on the slide, are about taking care of each other and other species, about the importance of Indigenous rights and the voice of youth, about recognizing that humans are not the most important or most valuable species, but one of many, about recognizing that we must speak up and that we must believe that we can make things better than they currently are. The next slide, please. The next, thank you. Most critically, the Accord sets out a set of responsibilities for faculties of education, responsibilities to ourselves and our students in terms of our programs and curriculum, for example, responsibilities within relationships that we have by building and supporting coalitions based on ethical relationality, responsibilities for our own environmental impact within our institutions. Think about all those travel budgets, for example. And finally, responsibilities for leadership in terms of transforming our own practice and within ACDE, holding each other to these responsibilities, holding each other accountable. So it's time to get to work. We recognize that the responsibilities and related challenges will be difficult, but we also recognize that the survival of life on our planet in its current form depends in part on our actions individually and collectively. The Accord notes that education is fundamentally a hopeful exercise. Although every day brings more devastating news, educators and educational leaders can do things now that will contribute to regeneration, justice, and a sustainable future. We intend the Accord to be a roadmap towards that future in faculties of education. So thank you for joining us as we have launched this new Accord on Education for a Sustainable Future. Now the real work begins. And Jan, before I close, I'd just like to offer you most sincere thanks, Miigwech, from the Association of Canadian Deans of Education and its 60 members for allowing us to be here today to share this new document with everybody. Miigwech, merci, thank you very much. Good evening.
Well, Sharon and Richard, many congratulations on this splendid achievement. Certainly the Accord will provide inspiration and a principled approach to ensuring that education and teacher education are helping us move toward a more sustainable and equitable future for our planet. And I'm particularly drawn to your mention of the importance of hope, which is something that seems to be, something that we really need in the world at this very moment. And I appreciate, as you say, it's time, and it's time to get to work on this. I invite everyone in the audience to take some time to download the Accord from the ACDE website, to read it and to reflect on it and the responsibilities for educators and leaders. And here, oh, we've gone past the slide that had our website, the website for it. Oh, we've gone back to it. So there you go. You can have a look at it there. So once again, I'd like to say miigwech, which is thank you to all of our distinguished speakers this evening, Naomi Klein and Avi Lewis, for just a conversation that was inspiring and certainly challenged us to do more. As well, I want to thank Richard and Sharon for joining us here tonight to share the launch of the Accord. And just to say miigwech to all of our audience members joining us. And I really look forward to seeing you again at future events. Miigwech.